It was December of 1991, Paris, France, the most powerful room in motorsport, and a Brazilian man stood alone in the middle of it, surrounded by people who had spent 3 years trying to take everything from him. They had stripped him of a victory. They had threatened to end his career. They had forced him to apologize for telling the truth. They had tried, in every official way possible, to make sure he would never be world champion again. And yet there he was, 3-time world champion, the youngest in history, standing in the house of his enemies, about to receive a trophy from the very man who had tried to destroy him. The room was not warm. It was not celebrating. Part of it was seething. And what Ayrton Senna did next, what he said, how he carried himself, how he looked that man in the eye, became one of the most quietly powerful moments in the history of sport. This is the story nobody tells when they talk about Senna's greatness. And it starts not on a racetrack, but in a ballroom in Paris, where the wrong man was holding the right trophy. If this kind of story moves you, the ones that happen behind the cameras, away from the podiums, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribe so you never miss one. To understand what happened in that room in Paris, you first have to go back 2 years. Back to October 22nd, 1989, Suzuka, Japan, lap 47 of the Japanese Grand Prix. Ayrton Senna needed to win that race to have any chance at the World Championship. His teammate and rival, the Frenchman Alain Prost, was ahead of him in the standings by 16 points. The math was simple and brutal. Win or it's over. At the first chicane, Senna made his move. He went to the inside. Prost turned in on him. The two cars collided, wheels tangled, and both came to a stop in the escape road. Prost climbed out of his car immediately and walked away. His job was done. Senna sat in his cockpit for a second, looked at the stalled engine, then somehow convinced the marshals to push start his McLaren, drove through the barriers, made a pit stop to change his front wing, and rejoined the track in 5th place. What happened next was something beyond sport. Senna overtook 4 drivers in the remaining laps and crossed the finish line in 1st place. He had done the impossible. He had come from nowhere in a damaged car and won. Then the stewards disqualified him. The official reason was that he had missed the chicane when re-entering the track. What Senna, McLaren, and most of the paddock believed, and what Jean-Marie Balestre himself would eventually admit 7 years later, was that the decision had been influenced. Balestre, the French president of the FIA, the governing body of Formula One, had intervened. His fellow countryman Prost was handed the world championship. Senna had it taken from him on paper while the crowd was still applauding. Senna did not stay quiet. He went to a press conference and said exactly what he believed had happened. He called it a manipulation. He said political and economic pressure groups had moved behind the scenes to make Prost world champion. He named the system. He named the result. He said it clearly and on record. Balestre's response was immediate and ruthless. He threatened to strip Senna of his racing license. He told the world that Senna might not be allowed to compete in 1990 at all. The World Motorsport Council voted unanimously to sanction him. Balestre announced that if Senna did not publicly retract his statements, there would be no super license, no racing. The message was as clear as it was cold. Apologize or disappear. Think about what that moment meant. Senna had just had a world championship stolen from him. He knew it. The paddock knew it. Journalists knew it. People who were there in that room at Suzuka when the stewards announced the decision knew exactly what had happened. The collision was on every television screen in the world. Prost had turned in. The gap Senna went for was a gap that existed until it was deliberately closed. And now the man who had ordered the outcome, or at least leaned on it as he would quietly confess years later, was telling Senna to say publicly that none of it had happened. To erase his own version of reality. To bow. The deadline came and went. McLaren eventually paid the $100,000 fine, and Senna, in one of the most difficult moments of his personal history, issued a statement. It was not an apology. It was a withdrawal. A carefully worded sentence acknowledging that there was no evidence of manipulation. a statement that satisfied the letter of Balestra's demand without giving him the word he actually wanted, which was surrender. It was enough. Senna got his license. He drove in 1990. And at that same track, at Suzuka, he won the championship again by deliberately putting Prost's Ferrari into the gravel at the first corner of the first lap. The man who had been forced to bow came back and answered on the only stage that had ever mattered to him. But the war between Senna and the European establishment was never truly over. It had only gone underground. Which brings us back to Paris. December 6, 1991. The FIA annual award ceremony at the Automobile Club de France. 175 guests, the creme of European motorsport, and Jean-Marie Balestre, still the FIA president, still in his seat of power for just a few more weeks before Max Mosley would replace him in an election, presiding over one final ceremony. The man he had tried to ban was now, undeniably, a three-time world champion. Senna walked into that room knowing what it was. He had won in 1988, 1990, and now 1991. 7 victories that season, 60 pole positions in his career. He had driven a car home in Brazil on a single gear, his gearbox failing for the last 30 laps, physically unable to speak when they helped him out of the cockpit, his hands locked in a claw around the steering wheel from gripping so hard for so long. He had done all of that, and more. And now he stood in a room in Paris where a portion of the audience had spent years wishing he had never existed. When his name was announced, the room did not erupt. There were applause from some quarters. From others, there was silence that had teeth. A few people in that room, supporters of Prost, aligned with the French racing establishment, expressed their displeasure in the way that European formal settings allow for. Not quite booing, but close enough. A cold reception. A reluctant acknowledgement, the kind of applause that feels like it is doing you a favor. Senna walked to the front of the room. Balestre stood waiting with the trophy, and in that moment, that specific fraction of a second before Senna reached the podium, every person in that room understood what they were actually watching. The man who had tried to ban this driver was now obligated by history to hand him the prize for the 3rd time. Senna accepted the trophy without theatrics. He shook the hand without warmth but without contempt, and then he spoke. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice in these moments. He did not demand acknowledgement or validation. He did not reference what had happened between them in 1989, not directly, not with names. He did not look at Balestre when he said what he said next. He looked at the room. He spoke about limits. He said that every person in every walk of life believes they have a limit, and that when you push toward that limit, something happens, and you discover you can go a little further. He said it was not physical. It was not mechanical. It was about the decision not to stop when every external force in the world is telling you to stop. He talked about faith. He talked about the kind of clarity that comes when you remove the need for the approval of others and simply commit to what you know is true. He said that he had experienced moments in a car where he was no longer driving consciously, where he existed in a different dimension, and that those moments had taught him something about what a human being is capable of when they fully surrender to their purpose. He said that purpose does not require permission. He said that greatness does not ask for consensus. The room, which had started cold, went very quiet. And then he said the thing that stayed with people for years afterward. He said he was not interested in being admired. He was interested in being complete. He said there was a difference between the person the world sees and the person you are at 3 a.m. when no one is watching and you are asking yourself whether it was worth it. And that the answer to that question for him was always yes. Not because of the trophies, but because of the commitment, because of the refusal. Because of every morning you chose to go further, when going further made no rational sense. When he finished, the room rose. Not partially, not politely, fully. Even the people who had not applauded when he walked in were on their feet, because what Senna had done in that speech was not address his enemies. He had addressed every person in that room who had ever been told they were in the wrong place, with the wrong passport, speaking the wrong language, representing the wrong country for the taste of the people holding the power. He had not won by defeating them. He had won by making them irrelevant. A few weeks later, in London, at the Grosvenor House Hotel, Senna appeared at the Autosport Awards in front of 800 members of the motorsport world. This time, the ovation when he walked on stage was immediate and total. Murray Walker, the legendary voice of Formula One, interviewed him for nearly 15 minutes. Senna spoke about Fangio. He spoke about the season. He spoke about never being satisfied. He said in his careful and precise English that he was as committed as he had ever been to his passion, that the main thing was to keep finding ways to stimulate himself, to continue the commitment at the highest level. He said his limit was a little further than others. He said it simply, without arrogance. He said it the way a person says a fact they have tested personally and found to be true. Ayrton Senna died on the 1st of May, 1994. He was 34 years old. He was leading the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola when his Williams left the track at the Tamburello corner and struck the concrete barrier at 211 kilometers per hour. He never regained consciousness. In Brazil, 3 days of national mourning were declared. 3 million people lined the streets of São Paulo to watch his funeral procession. Formula One has never fully moved past it. The sport he transformed is still measuring itself against the standard he set. But the thing about Ayrton Senna that matters most is not the records. It is not the pole positions or the championships or the wet weather performances that still look like science fiction. It is the fact that he was, by the standards of the world he competed in, an outsider. He was Brazilian in a European sport. He was emotionally transparent in a world that valued opacity. He was openly spiritual in a world that valued transaction. He was willing to say what he believed was true, even when saying it could end his career. And every single time the system told him to be smaller, he became larger. Every time a door was closed, he drove through a wall. You will face rooms that are not warm. You will walk into spaces where people are waiting for you to fail so they can feel comfortable again. You will stand in front of people who hold the trophy and feel no obligation to give it to you fairly. You will face rooms that are not warm. You will walk into spaces where people are waiting for you to fail so they can feel comfortable again. You will stand in front of people who hold the trophy and feel no obligation to give it to you fairly. You will be told your accent is wrong, your country is wrong, your timing is wrong, your manner is too direct, too honest, too inconvenient for the version of reality that the people in power prefer to maintain. The question Senna answered every single time was not whether those people were powerful. It was whether they were more powerful than his commitment to what he knew he was capable of. They were not. They never were. And the room always stood up in the end. If this story reached you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And leave a comment with just one word: Senna, because some names deserve to be repeated until they echo.